We're live!
Way!
Welcome back to Tiski Sour. We are all refreshed from a 4-week summer break. Politics hasn't stopped. August is supposed to be silly season, but it's been fairly eventful. We've got a new government, a new leader of the Liberal Democrats. The Labour Party is starting to take control of the news agenda again. Feels nice when it happens. To go through the big events of the summer for a roundup to get us up to speed about who is going to, I think, race ahead when Parliament... What does it do? Rejoin? Returns. That makes much more sense. When it returns in September. To do so, I am joined by James Butler, co-founder of Novara Media, and Ash Sarkar, not co-founder but senior editor.
Do I not get a wolf whistle?
I can't wolf whistle. Actually,
What can you not? No. You're just that good a feminist. Physically, your body will not allow you to wolf whistle a woman.
Quite musical in other ways, but I've never been able to whistle.
You can't whistle at all?
Nope, can't whistle at all. Never been able.
There's a whole episode of Peppa Pig about it, and she gets jealous because she's the only one that can't whistle, and then she rings up her friend Susie Sheep, and Susie's like, don't worry, I can't whistle either, and then Peppa Pig is like, yay, and then Susie Sheep is like, oh wait, hang on a minute, I can, and then Peppa Pig is like, fuck you, and hangs up the phone.
You've got an anecdote for everything. We're going to talk about the government of national unity, so we're going to talk about all the big things that have happened over the last 4 weeks, but I want to start with this week. As I've said, Labour have been leading the news agenda for the first time in a while. That's because Jeremy Corbyn wrote a letter to all opposition party leaders and said that he would be willing to, and is inviting them, to make him the leader of a national unity government, to block no deal and call a general election. It's gone quite well. I think Labour have sort of managed to take the lead, set the agenda for a little while. What do you think?
Well, when I saw not just the letter but the reaction to the letter, so the sort of collective soiling of pants on the Liberal Democrat side especially, I just thought, oh my God, is this what it's like to be on the front foot about Brexit? Because it's been so long since that's been the case for the left, and I was like, oh my God, this is how you man feel all the time. So that was great. But one of the things maybe it would be good to hear from James on is what are the actual constitutional mechanics which are set out in the letter? Because on the one hand, it's a statement of intent, a signalling that Labour is moving closer to this second referendum, remain on the ballot and fight for remain position in order to avert no deal. But it involves some quite delicate operations within Parliament too.
It does, and this is one of the reasons, I've watched this story develop and thought, in other times this would be a kind of flash in the pan, and it's sort of fortunate in some ways that it happened in August, where the lobby is sort of starved of its sort of usual diet of intrigue and gossip and whatever, and so it's sort of seized on this, and it's become a bit of a kind of political rocket in some ways. I should start by saying I don't think it's actually very plausible in any of its forms, right?
You don't think we're going to see Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister by October?
You don't think that we're going to see a GNU?
I don't think we're going to see a GNU, Government of National Unity. I think we will see Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister. I'm not sure it will be by October. The thing to say is that there are several stages to this, right? And all of them depend on some pretty close-run mathematics in the House of Commons. And they depend on people doing things that are not in what you would call their kind of short-term political interest. So it would require certainly some Tories to sort of blow up their political careers. In some ways, that's not completely implausible, but it may be a problem. I think so. The stages you would need to go through here are first, you'd need to table a motion of no confidence, right? So this is we've visited this place before. There was one in January. It's tabled with a form of words taken from the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, and this then, if it passes, initiates a 14-day period in which it is possible to form another government. And the reason that I've removed the agent from that sentence is a little bit unclear about how that happens. It's sort of a constitutional novelty, right? So before the existence of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, if the Prime Minister were to lose a confidence motion, the government would resign, or they would call fresh elections using their prerogative powers. That's the power that used to belong to the Crown, is now vested essentially in the Prime Minister. That no longer happens. There is this kind of new weird 14-day period to allow some scrabbling around to form another government. There's some argument that encodes it tries to bring through some of the stuff that the leader of the opposition might have done in the olden days before the FTPA. But anyway, so you have this kind of 2-week period in which it's not entirely clear who has the prerogative to form a government. John McDonnell has argued, and I would agree with him, that the constitutional assumption would be that the leader of the opposition is the person who would be expected to try to form that government. So the leader of the opposition is treated in British democracy as effectively a government in waiting, right?
But it's a sign of how poorly passed and thought through the Fixed Term Parliaments Act is that these procedures aren't fleshed out.
Yes, it is. It's also, I think, a sign that you can't do constitutional reform piecemeal. So the FTPA is actually quite a significant bit of constitutional change. It fixes or claims to fix.
What's the difference? So before, if a government loses the confidence of the House, you just automatically have a general election?
Not automatically. The government can resign and allow the leader of the opposition to attempt to form another government, which used to happen. It's quite common in the 19th century, early 20th century as well.
Why would they do that instead of just calling a general election?
Well, because it may be that a general election would be very, very bad for the governing party at that time. Right. And effectively, the point of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, which was not like a bad idea, was to remove from the Prime Minister the power to call an election at the point which is most advantageous to their party.
But of course, we saw in 2017 it doesn't necessarily do that.
Yeah, right, of course, because there's a political compulsion for the opposition. The opposition has to say, look, we're ready to go. If you're ready to go, we can form a government. And so it's very hard politically for the opposition to resist. Anyway, concretely what this means, and so the kind of fly in the ointment here is kind of twofold, right? One, you've got to pass the confidence motion, which, by the way, does not look completely certain. Is the question of what the Change UK MPs will do, what people like Kate Hoey...
It's not even that it doesn't look likely. Boris Johnson will most likely, if you're a betting person, win the vote of no confidence, right?
I think that's true, yeah.
I think that the Tory MPs that you would need to vote against the government won't do it. I think this business of the Tory rebel has been consistently overstated, and you've even got people like Amber Rudd who've done a full 180 on their politics just so they can keep a cabinet position. So I think that the general rule is, unless they have come to the end of their parliamentary life like Ken Clarke, it's very hard to envisage a Tory who has demonstrated that they've got the backbone or the integrity to put the country before their own careers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's been some interesting people. Guto Bebb, who's a Tory MP, has said, he would vote, that it would be better for the country to have Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister in a caretaker government than it would be to suffer no deal. But there, so there are various things here, right? So Parliament will return in September. It will sit briefly before conference season, and that's when Parliament rises again to go and have the various party conferences. It then returns in October. Now, it's certainly possible that the Labour Party could table a motion of no confidence in that period. To me, if I were advising the Labour Party on political strategy, I would say that it is unwise to put yourself in a situation where you're going to lose and have to endure the kind of, quite difficult, like, day-long political argument that a confidence motion entails. You saw last time Michael Gove spend a long time at the dispatch box, slandering Corbyn, whatever. It doesn't seem necessary to me to do it in September. It doesn't seem likely to me that minds will be concentrated that early on. So you then have conference... Well, I'll come back to it in a minute. You then have conference season. You then have October. October, minds might start to concentrate a bit more. It's important, I think, to remember that the only time we got something passed last time was very close to the deadline. This was the Yvette Cooper extension mandate last time, and that passed with one vote, very close to the cliff edge. And so you're really probably looking at October before you get anything serious along these lines.
Because it's only then that MPs are so desperate that they're willing to vote for something that
absolutely,
is controversial.
And I think it's pretty much reasonable to think that yes, Tory MPs are typically pretty invertebrate about this stuff. But they think there are other options. So the other option is they hope, so obviously you've got so when the Commons adjourns for the conference period, there'll be an adjournment debate. There will be various opportunities, maybe through an emergency debate, to try and take control of the order paper, maybe try to mandate Johnson to seek an extension rather than no deal. You also got the threat, and obviously we'll discuss Cummings later, you've got the threat that emanated from Cummings that actually, because if the 14-day period were to run out and we were then to go to general elections, Boris Johnson would fix the date of a general election after October 31st, so we would have left with no deal at that point anyway, by the time a new government comes in, whether that's a Johnson government, Corbyn government. So there are all these kind of moving parts. I really do think that a lot of this is actually about political positioning for what happens if no deal were to happen. So it's really important for Jo Swinson, for instance, to say, oh, well, I would never prop up evil socialist Jeremy Corbyn because she wants Tory Remainers to come to her side. She also has to be a little bit careful. I've written about this. She has to be very careful because she lost her seat in 2015 by effectively propping up a Tory government as part of the coalition. It's very likely that if she looks like she's enabling no deal, or she's enabling a Tory government, in the case that things got very close, then that's a pretty risky strategy for her. So the Lib Dems, like they're snakish, I guess, but their behaviour is kind of comprehensible if you think about it as thinking about what their electoral and party advantage will be in the case of an election.
Let's talk about the Lib Dems for a second, because I think you're right that this is mainly about positioning. So I think we want to talk about where the parties find themselves at the end of the summer, ready to go into very competitive few months. It looks to me like the Lib Dems have fucked up. Jo Swinson seems to have become leader with a lot of hubris around her and has kind of overplayed her hand, probably helped along by Chuka Umunna. The best transfer we ever did was giving the Labour Party giving Chuka Umunna to the Lib Dems. A strategic genius he's seemingly not. Do you think the Lib Dems have fucked up?
I mean, so what was quite interesting to me was in the space of a week, you had two opposition party leaders dramatically misread the room. The first being Caroline Lucas, leader of the Greens, and the second being Jo Swinson.
I'd forgotten about that.
And you would have thought that Jo Swinson, having had a look at Caroline Lucas's misreading of the room with her all-white lady government idea, the less said about the better, though I will probably get into that in a bit, that she would have tried to moderate her response somewhat. I think the reason why she didn't is, you're right, she is going for Tory Remainers because she knows that the Lib Dems are more in direct competition with the Tories for seats in the southeast than they are with Labour. And I think it's also the case that Chuka Umunna has ruled out categorically any work with Corbyn. The feelings amongst the Lib Dems themselves, though, are actually quite mixed. So Sarah Wollaston, previously a Tory, now a Lib Dem, she went via the independent group for Tinge, or whatever it is they're calling themselves now, was a lot less harsh. She was saying, well, no, let's stay open to this. There are a lot of Lib Dem party activists, so a decent portion of, the 15 of them, or however many there are, who think that it was a bad move as well, because part of their electoral strategy still needs to be hoovering up disaffected Labour Remainers. And if the Lib Dems say, we will do anything to stop no deal, but we won't do that, and they're seen as the main reason for why the Remain camp is so divided, voters quite easily will be led to asking the question, well, what are the Lib Dems for?
I think they were actually put in not too difficult a situation, because if I was the Lib Dems in that situation, I'd have said, of course we'll support Jeremy Corbyn to become Prime Minister. It's only for 5 weeks. It's only to stop no deal and call a general election. And then in that general election, we'll be fighting against the Labour Party because we have a better policy on Brexit. But what we hope is that if Jeremy Corbyn doesn't win, which he likely won't, win the vote of, win the confidence of the House to become the caretaker Prime Minister, then we expect the Labour Party to do as we are doing and support anyone who can plausibly become Prime Minister to stop no deal. But that's not what they did. And I mean, I think probably Jo Swinson's been watching too much Borgen and really thinks that she can become Prime Minister in the next 2 months. And her and Chuka Umunna are sort of sitting there and he's like, I can genuinely become Chancellor, only so that then he can sort of like sort of take her out and become Prime Minister without a general election.
I think the other thing to bear in mind is that Brexit has fried people's brains. It has full on marinated, seasoned and sautéed people's minds. And I think that this is actually how you ended up with the Caroline Lucas thing. Because before Brexit, Caroline Lucas was a credible critic of the Labour Party before 2015. Her race politics, while they weren't necessarily Angela Davis levels of sharp, they weren't awful. And she had a knack, I think, for reading political tone and understood her own left base. Whereas with the, segregationist government with Anna Soubry, she clearly just completely let her own very genuine fears about no deal completely scupper her own ability to make a political calculation.
Yeah.
And I think a similar thing has happened with Jo Swinson, not necessarily out of a genuine fear of no deal, but because Brexit and the fact that Brexit has revived the Lib Dems standing amongst, a certain section of, so-called progressives means that she completely miscalculated her own role in this entire drama. She's only relevant insofar as she is a tool to block Brexit. And if for any reason she says she doesn't want to do that, the caretaker prime minister could be a dog in a hat. She should be saying, we will get behind you to stop Brexit, because that's what we're fucking for.
I mean, yeah, just very briefly, a couple of things. The thing that seemed always to me unarticulated about the Caroline Lucas letter was that she included Emily Thornberry in it because she thought Emily Thornberry might be softer on, defending Jeremy Corbyn than Diane Abbott. That's the political calculation of that letter. Obviously, she can't say that. No one in the Labour Party can say that. But that's obviously what she was thinking, and it's obviously what quite a lot of ultra Remain political activists think as well. The other side of this is just that it does seem odd to me that the Liberal Democrats, while they were in government, wildly underestimated their political power. So effectively they were run around by the Conservative Party as the senior party of government, dumped on from a great height. The very famous, we voted for austerity, we got 5p charge on plastic bags, but that kind of thing, like not really leveraging the kind of political power they had there. And then they are now still drastically reduced in number from their height. And now they seem to me to be rather overestimating it on the basis of one European election and a by-election. And that seems to me to be unwise.
The most embarrassing thing that ever happened to the Lib Dems, I think, was the DUP.
Yes. Because
it just showed, they were like, we didn't win the most seats, so the most we can do is be a junior partner and basically be a yes man to someone's big project and try and get some very small side benefits involving plastic bags. The DUP went in there and said, look, that government relies on our votes and we can get them to do whatever the fuck we want. So, I mean, the Lib Dems have to be blamed for austerity, basically, don't they? Let's mop up Labour before we go to Boris Johnson's time as Prime Minister. This morning, I think it was this morning, Diane Abbott was on Radio 4 today saying that in a referendum, whatever was against Remain, be it a Labour Brexit or a Tory Brexit or whatever, she would be campaigning for Remain. Yesterday morning, John McDonnell said that on the Today Show. Emily Thornberry has been quote tweeting McDonnell and Diane Abbott saying, still, can you remember what the hashtag?
So will I.
So will I, yeah. Yes. Does this make Jeremy Corbyn look a bit silly? Everyone around him is saying, we will in any situation back Remain, and he's reluctantly not saying anything yet. So he's sitting on the fence still when it comes to what he would campaign for in that hypothetical referendum.
Here's the thing. In every realistic scenario that is likely to come up, Jeremy Corbyn has said that the leadership position will be Remain on the ballot, we will campaign for Remain. It's only in this, what if Labour secured an extension to Article 50 which allowed us to have both a general election and a second referendum with a renegotiation of the deal in between, that there is some lack of clarity. It's like me saying, in every single circumstance, I will be faithful to my partner, but on the off chance that I manage to link up with Anthony Joshua on a Friday night when I'm feeling foxy and have waxed my legs, then sure, maybe I'll have a think about cheating. So I think that one of the problems in the Labour position is that it hasn't necessarily been responsive to changes in terms of political possibility and political likelihood. It hasn't been able to say, well, look, realistically, this is where we're at, and so this is our position unequivocally. They've always tried to leave that door for renegotiation open. But we've all got cognitive faculties, and so do the other journalists who cover this. They're just being deliberately obtuse. The reality of the situation is that Labour are a second referendum plus Remain party, which means that they're in line with the Liberal Democrats in this issue.
The problem, though, is that it's not some mad hypothetical, the idea that there'd be a Labour Brexit versus Remain. That's actually plan A for the Labour Party. So the Labour Party have said, what we want to do is become caretaker government. We want to then win a general election, and then we want to renegotiate Brexit and then put Labour deal versus Remain to the public.
Me hooking up with Anthony Joshua is still plan A. It is highly unlikely.
I mean, look, there is also another party to this as well. The European Union does exist and has its own priorities. It doesn't necessarily make sense for the European Union to want to reopen the whole negotiating process and write another withdrawal agreement and then to see it subjected to, because presumably, as much as I would wish it otherwise, in a general election held anytime soon, it doesn't look likely to me that the composition of the Commons is going to change so substantially as to make it a dead cert that a new Labour withdrawal bill will go through without any problems. So the incentive for the European Union then to continue with this, sort of in-out, sort of half position, while probably entering recession itself soon, certainly Germany probably, while having the kind of the eternal Italian banking crisis looming on the horizon. So there are some problems here which are not purely, within the control of the British Parliament, and I think that's important for people to remember. Now, it's also true that the European Union has said yes, that because Labour doesn't have the same sort of positions about Northern Ireland that the Conservative Party does.
Different red lines, different deal.
Yeah, different red lines, different deal, maybe. But you're looking then quite a long way in the future. Then you've got the question of putting it to a referendum, in which case you have to pass legislation in according to the PPERA, which is the act governing party politics, elections, referendums, stuff like that. That then has to go through the Commons. That's amendable. The fight over whether no deal should be on the ballot will also be a huge question. It won't necessarily end up on the ballot, but I think there will be a significant chunk of Parliament who
it should be, really, shouldn't it?
Well, I mean, I think you can make a strong democratic case that it would be hard to remove. It would be hard to certify the question properly. Anyway, so look, there are some serious problems here. Whichever way you cut it, it does seem to me that the question here fundamentally is whether the Labour Party at the top should come out for Remain. That is a very difficult question to answer, and it's difficult because there is no clinching and no obvious answer to it. Anyone who says otherwise is lying either to themselves or to you. It doesn't seem clear to me that there's an obvious answer.
My answer is more the sort of just like, fuck it. No, fuck it. Let's just go Remain.
Well,
it's not exactly obvious, but sort of I'm resigned to it now. I think go for, look, we've got no more time for any of this faff renegotiation. Let's do May's deal versus Remain, potentially with no deal on the agenda.
This is the position that I probably come to because I think it's probably a politically unavoidable situation. It's also worth noting that the pressures on Corbyn in particular as leader of the Labour Party are different to those on constituency MPs, however high up they are in the shadow cabinet. As leader of the Labour Party, he has an obligation to try to hold together the internal coalition, which obviously in his case actually also has it's very strongly influenced by Unite. Unite's political leadership has always been very, very sceptical of any move towards Remain. I think it's important that the Labour Party sustains its relationship with the trade unions. And then there's the consideration of the electoral coalition, which is predominantly Remain, although not exclusively. I think it's right to say the salience of Brexit doesn't mean that we'd lose that many voters if we were to move one way or another. But, look, so and then there is, above all, the feeling that there should be some kind of democratic responsibility here. And ultimately, there are these two very conflicting notions of democracy at play, one of which Cummings is relying on working very, very hard to kind of rip against the other. The idea that democracy was this thing that happened once in this one event and then everything else is subject to it, or the question of whether it's sort of iterative and deliberative process. Those two things do not sit easily together, and I think we're living through their contradiction at the moment.
I mean, the thing is that I still think that the strongest argument against Labour taking a Remain position is one of democratic principle. And the basic heart of it is that if you are part of a vote and that vote secures a majority, then you have a reasonable expectation to trust that that vote will be carried out. Now, part of the reason why there can be a crap question put to the electorate, like a crap Leave campaign which doesn't have to flesh out what it actually wants all it has to say is not that, it's because we really do have a crap constitution. But you can't blame that crap constitution for the way people voted and try and wiggle out of, I think, delivering a democratic mandate. And I think all of these things are still true. My big however is that we also had Theresa May's vision of a hard Brexit being put to the electorate in 2017. And what happened was she lost her majority. You didn't see a massive increase in the vote share for UKIP or for a Eurosceptic party. And I think that could have quite reasonably been read by Parliament and by Theresa May as a mandate for compromise. She would have forced Jeremy Corbyn into significantly alienating one or the other part of his electoral coalition, which is either his Labour Leavers, if he says, I don't want to be a part of this compromise, or his Labour Remainers, if he takes it on and is seen to be the handmaiden of Brexit. Instead, she tried to play it as a matter of internal party management. And look where that got her. Now, because of the fact that that project to manage the internal contradictions of the Conservative Party has put us on a collision course with an outcome that nobody had talked about when we went to the ballot box in 2016, that means that Brexit needs a fresh mandate. And then you have to make a decision based on who are the votes that Labour are trying to go for, where is its membership at, what's the likely outcome of conference going to be, and also if the likely Brexit option that's on the table is going to result in thousands upon thousands of job losses, Labour make a decision about whether they're the party of we will go with Brexit at any cost because of a democratic principle and shove your jobs, or are we a party of continuity within a deeply imperfect system, a incredibly neoliberal and hostile to socialism trading bloc, and try and make a go of ourselves within that. That's the choice facing them. It's difficult, but I think it is obvious within that binary what they go for.
Yeah, I mean, just very, very quickly, and because I know we need to move on, and I think it's good to move on because we can get stuck in the Brexit mire. It's just to say, that we should also remember that the idea of exit itself is a bit of a chimera. If you're not planning to operate a total autarky, which I assume is not on the Labour Party's cards, dig for victory, then you've got to engage in the question, the political terms of trade and, a great deal of the way in which, the British economy operates will be determined by what happens in Europe, regardless of whether you're in or out. And in that case, you need to engage with the questions in front of you, which are about how rules change in vast transnational political economic organisations, which is a quite hard question to answer. Some of the answers are fudging, kind of demittance, retrospective permission for rule breaking, stuff like that. It's the case with Germany, for instance. But it's reasonable for people who are sceptical of the European Union to ask whether that allows for change at a fundamental level. I think that's a reasonable question. It doesn't convince me of the need for remaining a sort of hard Lexit Eurosceptic. I'm pretty much convinced the balance of political forces is going to make the Labour Party effectively a Remain party one way or another.
I love Lexit. I love Lexit so much. I want to kiss it. Lexit, the position that a Conservative government being in charge of leaving the EU will somehow hasten the conditions of socialism. I love it. Well,
no, they think we're going to get a Labour government and Labour negotiate Brexit. But anyway, I don't want to go into Lexit. I want to move on to the new government we have. But first of all, I've missed saying this. You're watching Novara Media, you're watching Tiski Sour. This show is only possible because of your kind support. So if you are already a subscriber, thank you very much. If not, please become one. As you know, we ask for the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. So I feel embarrassed saying it now because we obviously haven't been over the last 3 weeks. Work around the clock. Work around the clock,
but sometimes we also need to go on holiday. And then we come back.
I wasn't even on holiday. I was writing a dissertation. And there have been some people in the comments asking, why such a long break? We are going to make up for it. We are going to make it up to you. And that is going to be by this autumn. We are going to massively up our output, hopefully get a new studio. But also what we can definitely guarantee you is that the world transformed this year. We will be having a Tiski Sour, 3 of the 4 nights, so it's going to be nightly. And the night we won't have it is because there is going to be a huge Novara Media, I think 2-3 hour long extravaganza.
It's an extravaganza. I'm going to be hosting it. It's going to be like a mashup of, how do I put this? It's going to be like a mashup of Frida Kahlo and Leon Trotsky's Third Date and SMTV Live, if any of you watch that, with the poker rap and all hands on deck. So there's going to be big socialisms, lots of music, lots of fun, and also politicians doing incongruous things, a game show set up where they play against the audience. So you should come. It'll be great.
So yeah, not Tiski Sour, TWT, The World Transformed, they've announced their lineup today. So check it out, get yourself a ticket, and we'll see you in Brighton at the end of August. Let's talk about the new government. Boris Johnson has now been in power, or has been Prime Minister for 4 weeks. One thing he's been quite good at, I think, is message discipline. He's proved himself to be a much better campaigner than Theresa May so far, I think. So I wanted to just scroll through his Twitter briefly. Sort of an example of the messages they are putting out. It's very consistent.
Gary, line her up. Oh, there we go.
Line him up. So basically, it's actually a little bit too... Oh, there we go. The zoom in was perfect. It's a lot of talking about how we have to leave the European Union on the 31st of October. He's basically tweeting that once a day. And nothing seems to go out on his Twitter unless it is about a boost of money to the NHS, giving more powers to the police, or leaving the European Union on the 1st of October. They have 3 very clear priorities. Well, I don't know what their, we can talk about what their actual priorities are, but their public priorities, what they've decided the electorate want to hear, and what is going to be the mission of this government is to respect democracy, leave on the 31st of October, give more powers to the police, and properly fund the NHS. It's clearly a position which they have come to because they've recognised that it's popular. Each of those 3, leaving on the European Union is obviously divisive, but that's the purpose of their government, so they've got to go for that. And then give more powers to the cops, very popular. Give more money to the NHS, very popular. So this to me looks like an effective campaigning government. How worried are you? How worried should the Labour Party be?
Okay, so I think as a good rule of thumb, any major policy announcement, whether it's funding or chicken wings against stabbings, shouldn't be taken as a serious proposal that you pore over and assess on the sort of criteria of whether or not it's going to work. I think it's more useful to have a look at who do those policies speak to, who are the demographics that are being shored up when it comes to a potential early general election. And so I think that we've been able to see that there has been a half-hearted attempt to do some of that, red Tory, Nick Timothy, tanks on Labour's lawn stuff when it comes to, NHS funding. But again, it's not new money. It's easily discredited. It's not fleshed out. It's not really, I think, meant to stick a flag in the ground and claim that terrain. And then you've got the reactionary Home Office stuff. So you've got Priti Patel stripping citizenship left, right and centre. You've got a new immigration income threshold set at £36,000, which happens to be over £7,000 above the national median wage. It's also set above the salary of a senior nurse, of a newly qualified doctor. It's something which is likely to exacerbate staffing crises in our health and social care system. So again, not designed to work. You've got this business of chicken wings against stabbings, which I've already covered. And you've got the promise to end freedom of movement. Bang, no ifs, no buts, no mucking about on November the 1st without an alternative immigration system in place. The likelihood is that would lead to the next Windrush. So there would be initial disruptions on the basis of if you're an EU national who lives in the UK, but you've been away for some reason. So maybe you've been on holiday. I think that day also falls around during half term, and you try and get back in the country. You could have potential difficulties there. But then you have a longer term problem with, in particular, communities like British Somalis, many of whom came via different European countries before they settled here in the United Kingdom. They've got various citizenships, some of which are British, some of which are not, but you've got that very disruptive and piecemeal form of migration where you don't necessarily have all the documentation in place and you aren't able to demonstrate where you've been and for how long through each place that you left. And again, the state apparatus of surveillance, exclusion from public services, and then detention and deportation will fall heaviest on visible minorities who have some sort of disruptive or not thoroughly documented experience of migration themselves. But again, it's not supposed to function as an effective plan for how the immigration system is going to work. It's meant to reassure those Brexit Party voters that we, the Conservative Party, mean business. No deal means no deal. Brexit means Brexit. And the difference is that I do feel that while the Johnson government is hoping for some kind of last-minute reprieve in which Parliament finds a way to block no deal, they're able to go into a general election saying, see, we need a majority and we need Brexit Party voters to come back to us because we need to be able to put this disruptive Parliament back in its box. I think they'll be quite happy with that.
Yeah.
I mean, so first of all, for the freedom of movement one, in case any of our viewers haven't seen it. So I think that was announced yesterday, wasn't it? That Priti Patel said that freedom of movement will end if there is a no-deal Brexit on the 1st of November. It's a completely incoherent policy because the government have already said that anyone who is an EU citizen and currently resides in the UK can stay here. And they've said that you have until December 2020 to sign up or to apply for settled status. So what this means is that people they've promised have the right to stay here. It's not explained how they would re-enter the country if they were to go abroad. So I don't know if you're going to have people sort of lining up at Stansted showing the border officer your bank statement or your water bill to say, no, I do live here. It doesn't make any sense. But you're right. I think that what we're looking at here is a populist government. And I think this is what's different to Theresa May in the sense that Nick Timothy, I think, had a kind of coherent vision for the Tory party, which was basically Christian democracy. So it's this idea that we sort of have red Toryism, we have policies which to some degree is supposed to bring the working class into the Tory fold. But it seemed to be led by a vision for the country as opposed to opinion polls. Whereas
Theresa May, the best leader of the CDU that they never had.
Exactly. What this government seems to be doing is saying, what is popular? How do we get people on side to get through our one policy, which is basically Brexit? And they seem to be doing it quite well. What do you think, James?
Well, I think it's very easy to talk about Boris Johnson being on message discipline if you flick through his Twitter. That's obviously true.
Well, they're hiding him, aren't they?
Yes,
personally?
yes. So this is a man who has done almost no interviews in the run-up to his election, almost no interviews after his election. He has a very carefully curated public, persona. He has a very carefully curated series of public appearances. It doesn't seem to me that the cabinet are necessarily as on message or have as strong a message discipline as Number 10 itself. It's certainly true that the Tory party as a whole doesn't have great message discipline. It's certainly also true that there are obviously already signs of ructions within the civil service. Obviously, the big story this week has been the Yellowhammer leak, the leak of the No Deal preparation documents. You've had James Cleverly, the most inaptly named Member of Parliament.
I like to think of his surname as a cruel joke played by fate.
Yes, yes, indeed. I mean, he's been kind of squid inking all over the news. Gove has been squid inking all over the news. Oh, it's an old document. Actually, it's only 3 weeks old. Oh, but everything's...
No, 3 weeks, 18 days.
Everything's changed in the period since. So it already seems to me that this is actually not as coherent as some people like to suggest. It's also true if you go back and look at the press coverage when Theresa May came in and when Nick Timothy came in with her. He was treated in the same way that Dominic Cummings is being treated. Now, I know we'll come on to talk about Cummings, I'm sure, but the idea that there was like this kind of incredible strategy that was going to somehow eviscerate the opposition. It's important, I think, to remember sometimes that the press has certain kind of habits of reporting about certain facets of political life. So, for instance, Labour has a lunatic fringe, which is going to destroy the party in the estimation of the populace. This is a very common way of reporting the Labour Party right the way back until the 1930s, right? The Tory party has an extremely disciplined inner core which has found a secret weapon, who's been to Oxford and Cambridge and done all these things and is going to somehow destroy the opposition. So they fall into this kind of manner of reporting, which I think is rarely as insightful or as true as is sometimes believed. What is very clear is, in terms of what they're announcing, yes, they're trying to resurrect what was effectively the Thatcherite authoritarian coalition. That's what the law and order stuff is about. I'm sure we'll come on to talk about it in greater detail because it is interesting, it's important.
Yeah, I would really like to talk about the complete immolation of Theresa May's racial justice.
Thrown
out the window.
But so I think that there's good reason to be sceptical about this kind of reporting, and one of the reasons to be sceptical is that it's rarely been true when the same things have been said in the past. Your distinction also between a Christian democratic and populist government, obviously I think that I'm very hesitant about the Labour populist. I don't think it necessarily says anything of great depth. Many governments are led by opinion polls. Many governments try to get their key policies through by giving ground on certain things that they think the public will like. That's not an uncommon form of retail politics. I don't think it's a particularly great innovation on the Tory party's part. I think they do recognise that there is a potential authoritarian coalition in the country. I think they're also worried that in the case of any general election, if the Brexit party were to properly stand candidates, then they really do risk splitting their vote in various places. And particularly in those places where their majorities are pretty slim. It only takes a couple of thousand votes to a Brexit party candidate to really screw the chances of some of these marginal seats, and I think that is also going to be a calculation on their mind.
I mean, I think one of the questions that the Labour high-ups really need to be asking themselves is, do they have a plan for if Boris Johnson calls an early general election and has made a deal with the Brexit party? Because in that instance, Corbyn's got the more difficult electoral coalition to put together. And I think all of us are on the same page there, thinking that is just a basic fact on the ground.
They won't make a formal deal with the Brexit party. I think that would be too damaging. I think if you make a deal with the Brexit party, you lose so many marginals to the Lib Dems. So I feel like what we're witnessing over the last few weeks is the fact that the Brexit party, if you look at what the electoral landscape looked like after the European elections, you basically had four parties on 20%, and you had the Lib Dems and the Labour Party competing over the Remain vote, and you had the Conservatives and the Brexit Party competing over the Leave vote. What's happened now is that the battle between Jo Swinson and Jeremy Corbyn has intensified over the Remain vote, and I think, to be honest, that Labour are probably getting the upper hand now. But the Brexit Party have completely disappeared. After winning the European elections, they've gone. Like, you know, they're announcing some real odd-looking people on Twitter in terms of who's going to stand in each constituency, but they could be making the political weather. They could be holding Boris Johnson's feet to the fire, and they're not.
But this is the point. If the candidate is on the ballot paper, and there's and things are unclear still, this is a huge risk for the Conservative Party. So one of the reasons that Johnson is trying to put together this authoritarian kind of slant, because the electoral data will tell him that one of the best predictors of a Brexit Party voter is whether they're a social authoritarian, whether they think capital punishment is good, whether they think jails are good, whether they think, etc., etc. And this is, this is certainly...
I mean, everyone thinks jails are good, James.
No, they don't.
No.
Everyone thinks that you need jails. They don't necessarily think you need more jails. In terms of that, I mean, we should, because we've brought up the authoritarianism vibe now anyway.
I want to talk about the policing stuff.
We can talk about the policing stuff. So my worry here is that this isn't even just appealing to social authoritarians, and that's why I think they're doing a campaign which is quite intelligent, which is they've chosen the real low-hanging fruit, which they know that there's a huge majority in favour of. So in terms of I've got the data here, in terms of their plan about increasing stop and searches or reducing the limitations on stop and search.
More.
Yeah, haven't got it anyway. In any case, it was about 70%, I think, were strongly in favour of reducing the limitations on stop and search for the police. I think only 15% opposed. So that means you've got 15% who are without a strong opinion. So this isn't even like appealing to the authoritarians. They've just picked what are the most uncontroversial popular policies, which is give more money to the NHS, give a bit of money to the cops, and give them a little bit more power, and then we'll leave.
Okay, but this is the problem. I don't deny that there is strong support across the country for increased stop and search. And that's because the core myth of stop and search, which is that is an effective means of reducing violent crime, hasn't ever really been challenged. So you see all these graphs of this is the point at which stop and search was rolled back, and this is the point at which violent crimes started increasing. And because there's a correlation there, people assume causation. That's not the case at all. The Met Police's own data shows that there is a negligible impact from stop and search on the reduction of violent crime. What we've seen is that the increase in violent crime is a social symptom of economic misery. And it's an economic misery which is felt not just in terms of the increase in child poverty, not just in terms of a greater proportion of households being in poverty or rising income inequality. It's also the effect of public service cuts and those public services which the most vulnerable people rely on. I would like to see some data on the proportion of both knife crime perpetrators and knife crime victims in terms of how many of them have had contact with the children's social care system. I would imagine quite a few of them are known to the local authority. And Labour have not found a way to take the things that Diane Abbott does believe and has talked about, such as the public health model of reducing violent crime, and found a way of articulating it through a populist lens. And this has been a grave error, because there are all these areas in which Labour hasn't taken on disciplinarian ideology head on because it hasn't quite known how to message it.
Yeah.
And it has resulted in either tentativeness or the reliance on sort of quite techie arguments which don't have the emotional punch of we're just going to have more stop and search.
Something that the American left's better at doing, actually. I suppose because there's a huge... because their police are more racist than our police and more violent than our police. So there is a much bigger movement against that. So someone like Bernie Sanders is actually quite effective at arguing against the cops.
More violent, yes. More racist. Well, there is a greater disparity between the number of black people who are currently in prison and the number of black people in the population here than there is in the United States.
Yes, sir.
So we just have, in some ways, a politer form of racism, but in one regard, it makes itself known in a more acute institutional way. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So obviously I have quite a lot of thoughts on this. I won't go into them all. I wrote about them, or some of them, for the LRB last week. I wrote effectively on this question, in fact, about crime, about law and order, about the Johnson promise. I said there, and I think it's important, that there is a weakness, a kind of congenital weakness in Corbynism, when it thinks about the state and what the state does. And it's partly because Corbyn came to lead the Labour Party on the back of, the effects of austerity. And so the kind of default mode in Corbynism is to think about the state as effectively, like, basically a good thing, that various arms of it atrophy because, their funding has been choked off, so they're like an arm that's had the blood cut off to it, so it goes, you can't use it and whatever, and it kind of spasms or rots or goes gangrenous. And it sees the Labour Party's job as sort of restoring that funding. That doesn't engage then with the questions of actually then what that limb does, what what it's positioned to grab, what it's positioned to move. And this is nowhere more obvious than in the case of the police. In the case of the police, of course, there's a very famous theorist of the police, a guy called Egon Bittner, who's wrote in the 70s, who's in fact a refugee, kind of post-war. He'd been imprisoned in Auschwitz and moved to the US and develops an academic career talking about the limits of policing in democratic societies. It's a very, very interesting career. And he says, that there's ultimately no matter in society that can't ultimately be considered not the proper domain of the police. And so you have the police being effectively at the forefront of all these incidents of social emergency. Again, another one of his phrases is that the police, like Florence Nightingale chasing Willie Sutton being a famous bank robber. So there is this problem that the police are kind of coextensive with all the forms of social emergency, and therefore it's very easy to see that when you choke off funding to them, then inevitably, like the kind of stuff that they're dealing with in a kind of more generally frayed decade of austerity state is going to be extremely problematic. That said, it's probably quite right to say that maybe they shouldn't have all those roles together. Maybe we shouldn't be thinking about the police doing this kind of stuff. There's a longer term issue here about the way in which we think about crime, the way in which we think about policing, the way in which these things operate. Another very famous policing theorist, David Downs, accused Thatcher in the 80s of stealing the issue of crime from the left, right? Because he thought it shouldn't actually be a naturally right-wing issue at all, because he thought, like the early 18th century of thinkers who wrote about kind of police science, by which they meant actually predominantly political economy. They understood crime to be the outgrowth of a whole web of political problems, and primarily political economic problems. Thatcher did something very, very effective in the 80s, partly with the help of people like Sir Robert Mark, who was the chief constable, very outspoken, of reformulating the question being crime being a question of individual personality. And as long as the Labour Party effectively goes along with that message and doesn't stake out a different position on crime, it's always going to be playing catch up with the Tories. If you make crime a question of like personal fallibility and the moral question of the criminal, then Labour will always be playing catch up.
And that is what New Labour did, to be fair.
It
so
is
they ended up
absolutely what
being
New Labour
incredibly
did.
authoritarian
Yeah,
on
yeah.
crime. So you had, did the Conservatives get rid of ASBOs? So it
So
was Labour who brought in
ASBOs
antisocial behaviour orders, which was, like fining people for smoking in this,
Yeah.
or for being a bit
ASBOs
noisy on the corner of the street.
ASBOs got turned into PSPOs, which were largely the same thing, but there were different conditions for, giving someone a PSPO, because they were called public space protection orders. Now, Priti Patel is looking for ASBO-style powers, so it will be probably returning PSPOs to their earlier form. One of the things that I want to say about the issue of violent crime and how it's understood as a failing of personal responsibility is that it's especially understood as a failing of personal responsibility by people who don't have the first fucking clue what drives it, what the experience is of people who are affected by it. I was speaking to Camilla Tominey, who is an editor at The Telegraph, and this was in a green room before a TV debate thing. And
Spill the dirt, Ash.
She was talking about knife crime, and I was talking about, well, hang on, there are all of these factors. And she was like, well, at some point, doesn't personal responsibility come into it? And I just said, well, can you tell me a story of knife crime which, to your mind, is a failure of taking that personal responsibility? She didn't really say anything. And then I told her a story that I had heard, which was, this whole thing between Tottenham and Wood Green. Mm-hmm. It's really ugly. It's really ugly. And Tottenham and Wood Green are two areas which are being gentrified, so you can live there and be walking up and down the same streets and not have to experience the streets in the same way because you're not of the demographic that's primarily being affected. There was a boy from Tottenham. Some of the other side were about, and he was stabbed in the leg, and he wasn't part of this at all. He had no prior offences. Had a relatively stable home life. He wasn't part of a gang. He didn't carry a knife, and he was stabbed in the leg. He was taken to hospital. When he was taken to hospital, someone called his mum and told his mum what happened, and she ended up having a stroke, and she had to go to hospital. So when he got out and he was stitched up, and there was no further care for him, there was no support, there was no real use that the police had for him, because he's got no intelligence, he's not part of anything, he just happened to be wrong place, wrong time, like wearing trackies, so the other lot assumed that's what he was about. And there he is, deeply, deeply traumatised. Now, I've got no idea what happened to him or his family next. I'd heard the story from someone that knew him very well. But in bits of London, and not just London actually, because like knife crime is increasing fastest outside of London, that is a story that you will hear a lot. Like a lot. And if I was him, I would start thinking, well, maybe I want to be more protected by other people. Yeah. Maybe if there's no way for me to be in public space alone safely, then it's better I get involved than I don't, because at least then someone will tell me when the other side are about, or at least I'll have some people to back me up. And so this whole personal responsibility narrative, it's shaped at a distance from what's going on. And like, I know it's also ideological, but it's that distance and that lack of humility to acknowledge that you don't know the first fucking thing that you're going on about. That galls me.
Yeah, I just want to add to that maybe that, in terms of thinking about the way in which, obviously the thing we haven't mentioned here is Stuart Hall's very kind of prescient work on this in Policing the Crisis, of seeing this kind of authoritarian turn coming, the way in which Thatcher constructed this kind of, again I say authoritarian coalition, but it's worth thinking about maybe, like, because it doesn't seem possible it doesn't seem possible to me to return to a kind of pre-Thatcherite condition, which is again one of the kind of great intellectual vices I think of the Corbynite left. It doesn't seem possible to return in that sense, and it means, the kind of way we think about crime, the kind of way that the broad left thinks about crime, does seem to me, still to a very great degree stuck in the social imaginary of the sort of post-45 period. So you think in terms of black marketeers, addicts, East End gangsters, whatever kind of stuff. But actually, that tradition no longer is sufficient to think about the way in which crime is formed today, which definitely includes, you've got to think about kind of rogue traders, human traffickers, drug traffickers, international criminals, computer crime, information crime. So the form of crime has changed, and one has to be kind of sufficient to it when thinking about how to reform the police.
Let's do sort of 10 minutes on Dominic Cummings, and then we'll go to questions.
Sure.
Before I do that, you're watching Novara Media, you're watching Tisky Sour. This is only possible because of your kind support. If you are already a subscriber, thank you very much. If not, please go to support.novaramedia.com and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. As ever, like this video. Keep your comments coming. Share it on Twitter. Share it on Facebook. If you tweet a comment with the hashtag Tiskisour, I'll have a look and read them out if I like them. Let's talk
Read them out even if you don't, baby.
Yeah, potentially. Unless they're libelous or insulting to me, because I'm very sensitive.
But the rest of us.
Yeah, if you're rude about the other two, then fuck it.
James in particular.
Dominic Cummings. So, I mean, as you've said, you know, most of the time when you get a new prime minister or a new leader, there is sort of speculation about their new genius advisor. So for David Cameron, you had Steve Hilton. For Theresa May, you had Nick Timothy. For Boris Johnson, you have Dominic Cummings.
All balding men.
Hey.
They were all balding men.
You're balding by choice.
Whereas Seamus Milne still looks
Guarantee it's
dashing
not
because
by
he's the evil genius behind Jeremy Corbyn. Although with Seamus Milne, it's slightly different. People don't talk about him as the evil genius. They talk about him as sort of like dogmatic person, pulling the strings.
Very young looking. Drinks a cup of stem cells every morning.
Looks fabulous. Anyway, Dominic Cummings. He's talked about as sort of like the creative populist genius behind the scenes. He was obviously in charge of the Vote Leave campaign. And to be honest, he does seem like a somewhat interesting fella. I've been reading his blog over the last couple of days.
Did his blog remind you of anyone?
Ash has been saying, and I mean, if anyone goes, you can check out Dominic Cummings' blog, dominiccummings.com. Maybe we'll get it up on the screen. But at times it does read like Aaron Bastani writing about fully automated luxury communism, because it's very interested in the technology of the future. I think it's an interesting blog. So I mean, I think the left-wing Dominic Cummings is no bad thing.
There was some specific interest, in particular, on basically gene editing and gene sequencing and preventative medicine models, where I was just like, that's very Aaron.
Lots of AI. Anyway, I just wanted to read out a couple of some of the quotes that I thought was fun, and what we might expect whether we'll see fireworks now that he's in number 10, because he says some very disparaging things about the civil service in the blog. So there's a blog, the blog post I was reading was interesting. It's all about systems theory, and he's sort of looked at project management in what he thinks are the most productive and creative innovative spaces of the 20th century. And so one of these was the Manhattan Project, when they were designing the nuclear bomb. A bit worrying there, isn't it? The other one was Park, which is the Palo Alto Research Center. It was related to Xerox, the computer company. So this was where lots of the thinking behind the personal computer was developed. And anyway, he's got a big list of all the things that create a very productive workplace. And one of them is you have to have only great people. And this is where it gets quite brutal, because apparently in Park, which was, as I say, this research center where they were developing sort of the personal computer and stuff, they used to get all staff members to rank the employees in order of sort of like how effective they thought they were. And whoever at the end of the month was in the bottom quartile, they would fire. They'd try and push them into new jobs because they only wanted the best people there. And he links this to the civil service, which is somewhat interesting. So this is his quote from someone who worked at Park. People who stay together in a group are motivated by having other good people around them, and they're discouraged if they have to work with someone who isn't quite up to it. So if you can get rid of people who are not so good, the spirit of the place is improved. So that's a quote from someone who's working at Park in the 70s. And Cummings continues, this is totally opposite to how government works. The answer to many problems in government is simply that the caliber of the people dealing with very important problem X is shockingly low. But who will say you need to fire almost all of these people and get fewer, much brighter people on the problem, then give them freedom to work out without interference from relative dummies?
I mean, the camera's not on him, but right now James is rolling his eyes so far back he can see his own hypothalamus.
When you know saying this, A, will almost definitely not happen. So he's saying that they'll never get rid of the useless people in the civil service. B, will create problems for you. So it will create problems for you if you try and get rid of people in the civil service. In politics, the scale of smart people is completely wrong. So this is a guy who's going to go into the civil service with some real, I mean, potentially reasonable, and we can talk about that as well, but some quite explosive ideas about the competence of people who work in Whitehall. How do you think that's going to go down, James?
Well, I can't imagine it going down well.
Is that a good thing, though? I mean,
well, no. Look, okay. One, do not fall in to the trap of believing that all disruption is the same. Disruption from the left and disruption from the right are not the same thing. They are not mutually substitutable. They are not equal, and they are not, they cannot be thought in terms of each other in the same way. That aside, there is nothing in Cummings's work which is particularly striking or original. It is a pretty common experience of people who go into government saying like, oh, there must be some place beyond where I've got to, where like the real brains are making the real decisions, and and then eventually they get to the innermost place and they're like, oh shit, this is not the case. There are in fact, everyone is working with very partial information. Lots of people are slightly crap at their job. Lots of people's opinions are or political choices are informed by things that aren't entirely rational, or they make calculations incorrectly, and so on, so on, so on, so on.
Well, he's saying just they're self-preserving mediocres.
They're self-preserving mediocrities, yeah.
Mediocrities, thank you for the...
Sorry.
My vocabulary is mediocre, but I managed to keep the job. How did it happen?
It's that latent education.
But this is also not an unusual take on civil service.
She's everywhere.
Yeah, sure, okay, well that's fine, but unless we're going to elect Dominic Cummings dictator for life, then you have to manage an organisation which is enormously complex. Running a country is not like running a company. Running a country is not like developing microcomputers. It is a fundamentally different kind of thing. And Dominic Cummings is already discovering this. He's already discovering that actually, in order to govern effectively, you have to be capable of dealing with the factions. So he talks about the way in which these organisations function like courts, right? Like sort of medieval courts.
Yeah, so he calls senior civil servants, so Jeremy Hayward, the late Jeremy Hayward, he calls him the courtier fixer of Whitehall. So he's saying that all he is there to do is basically make sure that people get to keep their positions, and he's there to be people's allies, but not really to get anything done.
Well, I mean, the question is the opposition between the two, right? So it begs the question, how do you get things done in the British civil service? I think there's a very strong argument for shaking up quite a lot of the British civil service, by the way. I think they are, the permanent government, I think, they have a pretty small c conservative orientation to the world. I think they have like various unexamined assumptions, etc., etc., etc. I think all of these are fine things to discuss. It's also fine for Dominic Cummings to think, they're quite interested in their own preservation. That's quite a common critique of bureaucratic institutions. It's not a new thing. This is not a genius insight. You then have to ask the question of, why has it been difficult to reform the civil service for so long? It's difficult because running a government is a complex and difficult thing to do. It involves various forms of entrenched power. It involves various political factions, and the way governments run, unfortunately, it's a very ugly business, but it involves doing business and having to accept that these encode very powerful forces in society. You can defang them, you can attempt to conciliate them, you can attempt to reform them away with a democratic mandate. What you can't do is wish them away by an act of will. And this is always what I've thought about Cummings. He's a great campaigner. Campaigns are driven often by sheer will. Anyone watching this who has taken part in a political campaign knows that you find resources of will, of the ability to cajole, intimidate, flatter, persuade, hold together contradictory forces by the sheer force of your personality. The same is not true of government.
Start putting your questions in. So I'll start collecting your questions, but you go, Ash.
I mean, I'm inclined to agree, but let's also address this as a question of strategy and not just one of statecraft, because I think I agree with you. As you've said, Dominic Cummings is certainly not the first person who has observed certain efficiencies in the private sector and gone, why doesn't this happen in government? It's because you're all full of idiots. I mean, I've heard that from pretty much every man over the age of 45 I've ever spoken to. It's not original thinking. The main crux of how this plays out in terms of applied politics is that the strategy going into a general election is to fight it like a referendum, single issue, mission orientated. Here is the top line. This is what we're going to achieve. Nothing else matters. And one of the things that I think all of us are trying to grapple with is to what extent is single issue messaging effective amongst the electorate. Theresa May and Nick Timothy and Fiona Hill, this was their strategy as well. One of the things that everyone forgets is that 2017 was meant to be the Brexit election, and certainly Brexit will have higher issue salience next time around, especially if we haven't left, than it did in 2017. You can't just map one year onto the other and assume, again to quote Theresa May, that nothing has changed. But it showed that the electorate weren't single issue voters, and it meant that certain domestic issues were able to creep up while their back was turned and Labour was able to capitalise on it.
Yeah, look, that's absolutely true, I think. But like, there's inevitably going to be a polarisation again, I think, in any general election. I think that's one thing that both Labour and the Conservative Party can count on. Yeah, you know, look, one of the things that I think you're identifying, and which I think is really, really key, is the run-up period to a general election effectively determines the kind of question, the single animating central question that the election will be fought on, right? It means other things come into play and get thought of in terms of that question. It turns out that question was not, in 2017, are we in or out of the EU? Obviously, Dominic Cummings has said pretty explicitly he wants a people versus politicians election.
Has he been reading Chantal Mouffe?
God, she'd be embarrassed if that were the case. But that's what he wants, and certainly the Labour Party should be thinking about ways to jam and disrupt and recode that ahead of any election. The other side of this is, look, this question is not a question, you know, the Dominic Cummings' relation to the civil service. It's not a question which only exists for the kind of, you know, Britannia Unchained right. It also exists for the Corbynite left. The question of how you effectively manage, you know, the permanent British state, if you were ever to take power, be that in a government with a majority, be that in a government that's in a coalition, how you manage those factions and how you manage the civil service, and yes, frankly,
the security services.
The security services. Frankly, actually, the dodgier bits of the Foreign Office as well, and how you think about the ways in which the civil service should be reformed, because it very obviously should be reformed. That is not only a Dominic Cummings question. I don't mean to suggest, and I would never suggest, that the civil service is sort of unimpeachable.
All right, we're going to go to questions, and I think we're having some technical problems. Maybe our internet needs a bit of warm up after the 4-week break. But what that means is we're going to do these questions in a kind of quick fire way, because apparently our mouths are moving at a slightly different speed to the sound that's coming out, which is potentially frustrating for some of our audience, I can imagine. So we're gonna breeze through these questions, kind of quick fire. I'm going to sort of direct them at each of you. So I'm going to start with you, Ash. Daniel Eden, question: would it harm Corbynism if Corbyn did become a caretaker PM?
No, not really, because I think that the period of time is so small. It doesn't really speak to the core of the legislative programme. I think the harmful thing would be if Corbyn fails to become a caretaker PM in that 14-day period, and then he's faced with the choice posed to him by the Liberal Democrats, and they will pose this choice, of step aside or it's no deal. I think that would be the graver issue.
James, Matthew Shearing. Do people need to experience no deal Britain for a year before they turn away from Boris and the Tories and towards socialism?
No, this is, I think, something that's intellectually plausible, but probably ethically indefensible. I can see the temptation. It's a temptation that occurs again and again in the history of the left, right? That actually, as things get sharper and more unpleasant, and the real class contradictions are revealed, then people will break to the left rather than the right.
The KPD made this error.
Yeah, the historical evidence for this is not very strong, and I would say that there is also like a countervailing trend in the political history of the 20th century that conditions for struggle tend to be enhanced actually in conditions where there is greater autonomy for the class as a whole. So it's very plausible that the reaction to deprivation is to attempt to preserve what's mine.
Yeah. Ash Kaikiswani. Should the police be able to form Labour-affiliated trade unions?
So this is something which has come up again and again because, of course, the police can't strike. The police do have a professional association, the Police Federation, and the Police Federation has tended to be very, very reactionary. The left tends to have this view of more unions, more good. That's not always the case. There is a history of deeply reactionary union organisation, particularly in the fields of policing and the military. And you've got to think about how when certain arms of the state are formed because they inherently are supposed to exercise a particular form of power, what will the nature of their collective organisation look like, especially when it is that arm of the state against its